We're live.
Okay. So where do we want to start?
Oh, I think we start with your name first, Tom.
Okay, Longmuir. I played at Melbourne University from 1954 to 1957. I still remained at the club until about 1960. But having graduated in those days, we tended to, because we couldn't go to intervarsity, we tended to drop away and join other sides.
So we're getting just for the audience, we're going to get a full recap of Norm's history of Melbourne University Basketball Club.
Right. I started playing basketball probably when I was 10 or 11 at the Brunswick Presbyterian Church, and for...
Where was that?
That's just up in Sydney Road, Brunswick.
Right.
I then went to University High School and organised basketball there because nobody else would. And interestingly enough, probably 4 players from both the Brunswick Presbyterian Church and or University High School finished up in the Melbourne University Basketball team. So we've got a fairly long history there. In '54, when I came to university, the club had only just restarted. It had fallen away in 1952.
When you say restarted, what was it before you joined?
Well, there was no club at the beginning of 1953. All of the people who played prior to that, and there had been players, seemed to have either left the university, and often because they were either from interstate. In those days, for example, to study medicine, if you were a Tasmanian, you had to come to Melbourne University. There was no medical school in Tasmania. So what happened is when all those guys graduated and left, there was nothing here. And Keith Nichols joined, came to the university in, I think, '53. He wanted to play basketball, so he got organised, managed to get accreditation with the sports union, had a running fight with the Melbourne University Boat Club for the use of the initials Mubc. In fact, I know that he's put up a story on the website that he had to put Mubk C on his blazer because they wouldn't let him just use Mubc. I came along in '54 with a fellow called Rhys Lewis, who came from Scotch College, and a couple of others, and we improved the quality of the basketball side about 100% because you know, they were very. The whole club at that stage comprised about 8 guys. That was the whole club.
When you say there were some guys that were playing beforehand, maybe 52, was that another 8 guys, or like?
The guys who played in '52 disappeared, and the club disappeared. And again, I think it's because they in particular, I remember a fellow called Townley. He was Tasmanian. He graduated and went home.
So there was really only maybe 1 team of them before you
Oh
guys?
yes, there was only ever 1 team. And for 54, 53, 54, 55, we started to get enough players to have a second team. 56, we probably had 3 teams. 57, which was the first year that we had a coach, we probably still only had 3, maybe 4 sides. I went to intervarsity in 1954, which was in Queensland. We had a fairly checkered tournament. I managed to carry what I thought was a cold for the whole of the tournament, but it developed into pneumonia, and in those days we couldn't afford to travel by air, so we used to we took a train from Melbourne to Brisbane and a train back. On the way back, I was so ill that a fellow called Reese Lewis and another guy called Neville Quarry picked every lock in the from carriage to carriage all the way down to the guards van to warn them that in their medical opinion, one was a dentist and one was an architect. They had a very dangerously ill person on board. They stopped the train at Taree, took me off, put me in hospital at Taree.
So they were trying to get medical aid for you?
Yes.
And they were picking locks to steal their way into people's rooms?
Well, they had to go right through. Well, the carriages were all independent, all those, what we used to call dog boxes. There was no, you couldn't walk from one end of the train to the other. So the guard got quite a shock when those two people appeared in his guard van, but that did the trick. They managed to get the message through to Taree. The train stopped, which was a non-scheduled stop. I finished up in hospital there for 2 weeks. Reese and Neville stopped there for a night or two to make sure I was okay.
Sounds like you were the first Uni Games casualty.
Yeah, and that was coming home. My parents actually paid for me to fly home, and in those days the planes that stopped in Taree were converted World War II bombers, I think, because I can remember thinking this is a fairly hairy experience, but I managed to get through that and survived the year.
Were you guys playing in a competition outside of
We were
intervarsity?
playing in a competition called Business Houses. In 1953, Keith had tried to get it into competitions and been knocked back by a number of people, but finally accepted into Business Houses.
How many competitions would there have been at that time?
There would have been probably a dozen or so competitions.
In Melbourne?
In Melbourne. And there were, a lot of them were church competitions. There would have been the Presbyterian Church of England, Church of Christ, CYMS, the Catholic one. They all had their own competitions. We had business houses, and there were 2 or 3 others, and I don't know what the composition, but I think there were more than business houses tended to cater for businesses and companies, and somehow or another Melbourne University qualified in that situation.
It's funny you mentioned business houses because a bunch of us still play in the business houses competition. VBHBA runs on Thursday night at MSAC.
Ah.
Where did you guys used to play for that comp?
We used to play in a place called Worth's Olympia, which was probably where the Art Centre is now.
Right.
It was next door to a place called the Trocadero, and it was the Worth's Olympia was a roller skating rink. So the floor was very, very smooth, very hard concrete, and it was. I can remember carrying many bruises home from some of those games.
What was the basket setup like?
Pretty much, well, they were fixed baskets, but they were pretty much like they were today with a backboard, although they were normally wooden backboards. You wouldn't have seen any plastic backboards. There was usually enough room to do a layup and follow through, but there was no guarantee that the surface was reasonable beyond the court itself, to be honest with you.
What about the size of the court?
Probably regular size, probably the same size as they are now. When I first came here, we used to practice in the Melbourne University Regiment Drill Hall, which was over in Grattan Street. And the baskets there were flush up against the wall, so if you did a layup, and it was your tall successful usually finished up splattered against the wall. So you had to learn to turn very quickly after you'd had your shot to avoid that sort of situation. 55, we continued to play in business houses. And we continued to play, I believe, still at Worth's. We started
When you say it was where the Arts Centre is,
in St Kilda Road.
when did they build the Arts Centre?
Ooh,
After that, I'm guessing.
wouldn't have been until the 80s,
Right. And so
20 years later.
there used to be a basketball court there,
Yes, yes.
an ice skating rink,
Right.
a skating rink, basketball
Roller
rink,
skating,
roller
not an ice skating rink. We started to play probably in 56, I think we probably started to play our games at Melbourne Showgrounds. We never got to play down at Albert Park because it didn't exist until after the Olympic Games, or probably during the Olympic Games in 56.
I thought they held the basketball at the Carlton Gardens Royal Exhibition
They
Buildings.
did, but and that's where all the tournaments were. They built a stadium on the north side of the exhibition buildings there.
Is that stadium still part of the exhibition
No,
buildings?
it was torn down probably 10, 20 years ago.
So during the 1956 Melbourne Olympics, did they play any basketball inside the exhibition buildings?
No. Oh, well, they played. That was when I was playing in the Presbyterian comp. We used to play at the exhibition buildings inside,
Right.
including upstairs,
They had an upstairs
which was a
court.
fairly hairy experience, I can tell you, because there was a lot of corners there, and you could easily go over the rail if you weren't at all enthusiastic about playing.
Did you ever lose the ball?
Often lost the ball. Well, they had courts end to end, side to side, and that was one of the hazards of the place. You'd often get a ball coming from a neighbouring court, but the pillars were always in the way, and so there was only one or two courts that were actually regular. Most of them had some sort of structure in the middle of the court, or not in the middle, on the side of the court.
That's incredible. I'm just picturing Olympic basketball occurring in Carlton Gardens.
Well, there was a single court. It was purpose-built
On the side of the exhibition
on the
buildings?
north side of the exhibition building, and they
Where the new museum is?
no, that's further north.
There's a gap.
It was right on. I don't know. There's some years later I went there to things like motor car exhibitions, and they used it as an exhibition hall for cars, and you used to be able to walk from the main exhibition building just through the open doors into the extension. It was right flush up against the building.
Right.
During the Olympic Games, well, let's go back to 1955. 1955, Melbourne University played intervarsity down in Hobart, and that was the only time that our star centre, Bruce Lewis, got rubbed out, because he played up against a fellow called Mike Townley, who was captain of Tasmania and who subsequently became a federal member of parliament, I think a senator. But he was the dirtiest player that Reece ever played against. And Reece managed to get himself sanctioned, and it was the only time Reece never made the All-Australian side.
Reece touched him up.
Well, he flattened him in a fairly obvious manner.
Got called for the foul by the sounds of things.
Yes. But we had a fellow playing for us that year called Fred Lakeway, who was an American here, I think, on a Fulbright scholarship. And he was the star of our side then, and he was a brilliant player. And he became great friends with a fellow called Graham Pascoe, who was also in the side. And they corresponded for years afterwards. Fred, when he finished at Melbourne University, or his year at Melbourne University, went back to the States and eventually joined the American Navy and became a jet pilot, a fighter jet pilot. And Graham used to frequently tell us about his exploits flying these supersonic aircraft and make us all very envious that we weren't given that opportunity. We didn't win the tournament either in 54 or in 55. In 56 we went to Sydney, play intervarsity, and that was again a fairly nondescript intervarsity as far as Melbourne was concerned, but we did come up against a guy who turned out to be the centre for the Singapore Olympic side. He was playing for Sydney, and he was a 6'5", 6'6" Asian boy who could jump over the backboard, we think, because he was absolutely a outstanding player.
During that Olympic lead-up, did you guys have any involvement with the Olympic teams?
We played 2 practice matches, once against the Singapore side and one against Canada. On both occasions we didn't win, which is not surprising. And we played both games down in an army drill hall that used to be on the corner of Hoddle Street and Commercial Road, which I think now has been taken over by the Alfred Hospital.
Right.
The rules for the Olympics teams in 1956 were that they were not allowed to play each other in practice matches prior to the games. Now, we in Australia really, that was the first time that Australia, because they were the host nation, was able to play in basketball at the Olympic Games, but we didn't really have a high standard. Most of the side were made up by Europeans, Latvians, Lithuanians who had migrated to Australia after World War II, and there was a competition here in Melbourne, which was pretty well exclusively Latvians and or Lithuanians.
Do you recall what it was named?
I think it was called Varga.
Right.
And and the same thing applied in other states, so that if you were to look at the list of names for the Olympic side in 1956, I would think about half of them were former European.
The Aussie team.
Yeah, the Aussie team. So although we were nowhere near the level of the Olympics sides, they were desperate to find teams to play against in practice games, and we were lucky to get a couple of games. During 1956, the Mormon Missionary Church became a source of basketball for not just Victoria but the whole state. Ken Watson was Secretary of the Australian Basketball Association, as well as being Secretary of the Victorian Association. He was also the coach of the Australian side, I think, on that year. And he had approached the Mormon Church to try and encourage them to bring their as many players among their missionaries to Australia. And they complied with that and agreed, and the Mormon used to play in the Victorian Amateur Basketball Association as a side. They inevitably won because they were head and shoulders above the best sides, and in practice games against some of the Olympic sides, they actually beat France, who came third in the Olympics.
Really?
So they were pretty good, and they played Russia, and I think ran them very close, and they played and beat countries like Brazil.
Did you guys used to play against that Mormon team?
We didn't, no, but I at that stage was secretary of the club, and somehow or another
Secretary of Melbourne Uni.
Melbourne University, yes, and somehow I found myself on the committee of the Victorian Amateur Basketball Association, and I approached Ken Watson to from the point of view of trying to get a coach for Melbourne University Basketball Club. And Ken suggested that I approach the Mormon Church because he couldn't suggest anyone other than those as a coach, because it was relatively uncommon to have coaches in those days. So Rhys Lewis and I went to see the president of the Mormon Church over in Toorak Road, I think it was, and he listened to what we had to say and told us he'd get back to us, and subsequently called us and said, yes, we can let you have one of our guys as a coach. There are some conditions, but and a gentleman called Harold Reid turned up to our Saturday practice session a few weeks later.
This is Elder Reid?
Yeah, Elder Reid, Harold Reid, and I think he got the shock of his life. He wrote in his diary that he was quite amazed about these young players. And I must say, when he said young player, he was roughly the same age as we were. But we didn't have very good ball skills, and we needed a lot of work. Well, he worked with us in the 1957 year for the whole year, and we started off playing a couple of visiting American warships, teams from visiting American warships. We often practiced against the Mormon team. By the time the competition started, at this stage we had, and I don't quite know how we managed it, we got ourselves into the reserve level of the Victorian Amateur Basketball Association, which was one level below the top level.
Of Australia?
In Victoria.
But in Victoria was probably the best comp, I'm guessing?
Oh yes, although Adelaide and Sydney were also pretty strong.
Sorry guys.
Well, we're talking about the 1957 year, and Elder Reid coaching us, and he took us to the point where, when we started to play in the reserve grade in the VBHBA, we won every game for the year, but unfortunately we lost the grand final.
This is the reserve grade of the VBHBA.
The VBHBA won every game, and we lost the grand final, but we managed to convince the committee of the Victorian Amateur Basketball Association that our team was pretty good, and so we deserved to be put up. Up to that point, only one team was ever promoted. But in 1958, they promoted two sides. So we managed to field a side in the top level of Victorian basketball for the year of 1958. The side, I don't think, did all that well, but we certainly played at that level.
So Melbourne University has played at the highest level of basketball in Australia at some point?
Pretty much.
Who are you playing against? Any famous names?
Well, we played against teams like Church, which included Lindsey Gaze, Bill White, both of whom were in the 1960 Olympic side. We played against, the way the Victorian Amateur Basketball Association worked is that there was one team, a representative team from each of the affiliated associations. So there was a business houses side,
right.
There was a Varga side, there was CYMS side, Presbyterian side, although I think the Presbyterians were there. Church of England, of course, was the team at which Lindsey Gaze and Bill White were in, and Ken Watson coached. So we're up at a pretty elite level, really.
Where were they held?
At that particular year, we also managed, 57 was the first year that we had access to the Borough Centre. It was built in 56.
At Melbourne University.
And we were able to play all of our reserve games in 57 here at Melbourne University. But for 58, when we got into the top level, I think we played some games here, but many games down at Albert Park.
At the old Albert Park.
The old Albert Park.
Right.
So
and were there other games at other locations as well?
I think our seconds and thirds were still playing both. Well, at that stage they would have been playing at Albert Park. I think they discontinued using the showgrounds once they opened up Albert Park.
What about the other clubs? Did they have home courts elsewhere?
Well, not really. They used to play in church halls, and
So when you played against them, would you play against them
no, they
exclusively?
tended to play at the top level. We'd all play at Albert Park. Albert Park was very heavily used. It used every night of the week. And it was only after the 1960s that they began to build purpose-built basketball stadiums around the rest of the suburbs. There were no stadiums as you see them today. I think they built one in Coburg, I think they built one in Ringwood, I think there was probably one out of Dandenong, but there were none of those, they didn't exist in 1958. So, and the popular way to get a stadium built was to convince the Victorian Railways to lease some of their land for a nominal fee, and then the club, the various associations would raise funds to actually build a stadium, but they didn't actually have to buy the real estate in the first place. Now I don't know what happened after that, but that's how it actually started.
Right.
In those days, also there were only 2 wooden courts at Albert Park. That's the number 1 court and the reserve grade court. All the other courts were concrete. And I think as time went by over subsequent years, they all became wooden floors below. That was past my time. One of the interesting things that happened in the 57-58 period is that in order to get the funds for Albert Park, the Victorian Amateur Basketball Association decided that all of the teams, and we convinced them that Melbourne University was an association in its own right, because we had 2 or 3 sides, and we were playing between the various faculties, therefore we were an association. And we'd introduced basketball as an interfaculty sport. But when it came to putting in the money to build Albert Park, we pointed out that we were all very poor students. And one of the trade-offs, because good courts were in short supply, of us not having to contribute to Albert Park was that the Basketball Association could use, and we could play our home games here in the Beaurepaire Centre.
The Beaurepaire Centre being the old stadium, not this one?
Not this one. This is all brand new from my point of view. This didn't exist in the period of the 60s, 50s and 60s.
When I joined Melbourne University Basketball in 2002, I recall the court at the Beaurepaire Centre, if you call it a court.
Yeah.
And that's where our new gym is. They built a gym over it, so there's no court there anymore.
Okay, well, the first basketball rings we got there, I actually managed to get them from the North Melbourne Town Hall. I borrowed my dad's truck on one evening and spoke to Ken Watson, and there were a couple of disused basketball rings which were a bit like Trojan horses. They were huge structures that you needed a 5-ton truck to put them on, and so I managed to get them over because we had no basketball rings. They built the Beaurepaire Centre without any basketball rings, and so we used these for a while, for the first few months, until we could convince the university to loosen their purse strings and actually pay for basketball rings to be installed in the centre. but unfortunately that was a fairly botched job because they had to be retractable basketball rings, and there were no engineers in Melbourne who knew how to build retractable basketball rings in those days, so that the rings were usable, but they were you know, if you didn't hit the basket dead centre, the ball would spray all over the place because the rings vibrated and the board vibrated in a way that you wouldn't believe. But at least we managed to convince after we got all of this installed, the VBHBA, that we were able to play games there, and they were keen to get another court, so that's how it went.
At this time, was there any such thing as women's basketball?
No, women. I don't believe there was any women's basketball played in Victoria. If you look at the university records, what is recorded as basketball is what is now called netball. And
So they used to play netball but call it basketball?
Yes, Melbourne University played netball, but called it basketball. And they played that from the 1930s.
Right.
And there's actually a record of a male player, basketball player, who was awarded a blue in 1930.
A blue being Melbourne University's full blue award for outstanding contribution to a sport at intervarsity.
And so, but we don't know from the records whether he played what is now called netball, or whether in fact there was a Melbourne University basketball side.
Right.
In the 1930s. So, and there were awards given to men, very few of them, through the 40s and right up until 52.
Just leave it there, Lumi.
But I haven't been able to discover whether or not we were talking basketball or netball in those early years.
Through your long and storied career at Melbourne Uni basketball, you've probably got lots of fond memories. Are there any other ones that stand out?
I think the standout year was 1957. Intervarsity that year was in Perth. Again, being a poor students, we had to go there by train and back by train. So we had 3 days on the train to Perth and 3 days on the train from Perth. We were accompanied by all the women's tennis teams from all the universities.
That would have been all right.
And unfortunately some of the football teams.
In a competition.
But there were a number of interesting relationships established that lasted for intervarsity.
on the 3-day train ride, yeah, I'll bet.
We also had a watering stop somewhere in the middle of the desert. We decided we needed to get a bit of exercise. So I can remember a photograph that we took of us standing around in a circle throwing a basketball in the middle of the Nullarbor. Perth was the only university we actually won in my time at Melbourne, but unfortunately it wasn't a straight out win. We shared it with Sydney and Western Australia, I think, because we each lost 1 game, and in those days the winner of intervarsity was simply decided by where you stood at the end of the round robin tournament. There was no grand final or playoff or anything like that. So it was a 3-way tie. I think we beat Sydney. I think Sydney beat Western Australia. I think Western Australia beat us. I think that's the way it went. And we beat all the other side, each of us. So we only lost 1 game each. But that was enough to tie the thing up in 3 ways.
Back in those days, was there a big social element to intervarsity like there is today?
Yes, there was, and the problem with the Perth event was that the big social evening, which was combining the basketball players, the tennis players, and the football players, was held in the home, which was a mansion, of one of the Perth players, and I don't know how that player, boy or girl, ever explained what happened to their house to their parents. But I'm quite sure that the house was never the same again.
How many other sports were played at that time?
In terms of what, at the university? Well, there are only 3 sports together at the one, in the one state at that time. So other sports that were being played would have been played in other states. So there was no limit on it, but it just, the way that the timetables fell, that we just happened to be in Perth with the other 2 sides. I think most of the fun was the fact that we actually travelled there with them, 3 days on the train, travelled back 3 days on the train, which was a fairly interesting time. We were probably only there, the university only lasted about a week, I think, or 7 or 8 days maximum. But we were waiting pretty much for the whole fortnight and we used to see the other teams. We used to go to their matches and they used to come to ours.
So you would play against, how many games would you play over the course of a tournament like that?
Well, there would have been, the teams that competed in all the universities I played at, there was, apart from Melbourne, there was Brisbane, Sydney, Adelaide, Tasmania, and that was it. So it was, what, about 6 sides? Western Australia, Adelaide, Victoria, Tasmania, Sydney, and Brisbane, and because we didn't have Monash University in those days, there was no Monash. There was a Institute of Technology, New South Wales Institute of Technology came into being, and I think they probably played in the 57 tournament, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. But you didn't have the number of universities you now have. So you know, I hear people talking about competitions in order to get into InterVarsity. Well, that just didn't exist. There was still 6 or 7 teams, and that was it. And you played this. You know, you got to know the opposing players. In fact, some of the friendships that were established in those days were in fact cross-university friendships. And I know, for example, that Keith Nichols knew the names of pretty well every player in the Sydney side and the Brisbane side. And in fact, I many years later met one of the Brisbane players when I was on holidays up on the Gold Coast, and he remembered me, which was great. And because he went on, he was a fairly senior official in Queensland basketball for many years after that. I didn't know this until I met him later. But
what was his name?
I'm trying to think of his name, to be honest with you.
Actually, out of curiosity, the career you're describing at Melbourne Uni basketball wasn't terribly long.
No.
Is that due to, was there a requirement that you needed to be a student to be a part of the club?
First of all, you could not play InterVarsity unless you're an undergraduate.
Sure.
In that we'd only just started the club up again in '53, and we'd only built up to probably four teams by '57, and that just, you know, no women, of course. That there was no, and one of the problems was that I think in most sports at Melbourne Uni, once you graduated, you left. I know, for example, with cricket, I don't know what the rules are today, but cricket, the first 11 played in the Victorian Cricket Association. Now, if you played for Carlton and you went to Melbourne University, then you automatically had to play for Melbourne University. So guys like Alumni, who I played with at Carlton in the cricket side, he came to Melbourne. He had to play for the Melbourne University cricket side, but as soon as he graduated, he went back to Carlton. And in my case, I didn't bother to play cricket after high school, but a lot of players, I think, in some of the other sports had similar types of rules. So while you're at uni, you played for uni. When you left, you went back to your home club.
Right.
So, and that would have applied to some degree in basketball, in that I played Presbyterian competition up until uni, and if I wanted to continue playing basketball afterward, I would normally have gone back and played in the Presbyterian competition. But you know, there are very few players in the 50s and 60s who continued to play for Melbourne University after they graduated.
Did you continue to play basketball after Melbourne University?
Yes, I did. I actually played for, in 1958 I played with the church side with Lindsey Gaze and Bill White and those guys. And then I remember coming back to Melbourne for and playing and coaching I think the seconds for a year, but then drifted out of basketball because I decided I got married and we started to think about families. But in later years I again hooked up with 3 or 4 of the players from Melbourne Uni, and we played in business houses again, you know, at a lower level, but which was good, you know. And we actually won a premiership, as I recall, in those days, but
Not under the banner of Melbourne University.
not under the banner of Melbourne University. So that was, you know, I don't think there was any rules on it, but if you weren't an undergraduate, you couldn't play intervarsity. If you couldn't play intervarsity, then you normally could have played either for your original club before you came to Melbourne, or you could have continued to play for Melbourne, but very few players did.
Right.
You know, I don't recall any who played for any length of time after they graduated.
Who was the best player you ever played against? Or with or against?
I would have thought, well, the best players I ever played with or against were the Melbourne Yankees. I would have thought our coach, Hank Reid, would have been as good as any player I'd ever seen. I can remember watching him play for Victoria one evening, and he was charging at the basket to do a layup. Someone tried to block his right hand and flicked the ball to his left hand and hit the basket anyway. Now that's stuck in my mind ever since as being the most outstanding piece of work I've ever seen. Most of the Americans, I mean, one of the Americans was a fellow called Dalal Kundi, and he was asked by Lindsey Gaze why the Mormons never played the Americans in the lead up to the '56 Olympics. And Dalal Kundi answered by saying that he was sick to death of being beaten by Bill Russell, and he wasn't going to do it out here, because that's what happened to him, you know, when he was playing back in the States.
Bill Russell was
captain of the American side in '56.
Must have won close to a dozen NBA championships, that bloke.
He was one of, I think there are only 3 or 4 players who won an Olympic gold medal, the NCAA, which is the amateur competition, and the NBA. And there were two of them in that American side. Casey Jones was one, and Bill Russell was the other.
I seem to recall that he took University of San Francisco.
Yes, they both played for University of San Francisco.
I'm pretty sure I went in, like I used to live there, and I went into the gym and I saw Bill Russell's championship trophy up on in the trophy cabinet.
Yep. Yep.
Pretty small school too, like very small school. That's incredible.
Well, he was considered one of the all-time greats, I think, of American basketball.
Did you see him play at the Olympics?
I used to travel in the bus with him. I had a job out at the Olympic Village with the Road Transport Association. I was a transport officer. Our job was to make sure that the athletes caught their buses, both for the practice sessions and for the actual games itself. And I had an occasion where I was riding my motorbike around the village, and this terrifically good-looking young American swimmer came racing out, screaming that she'd missed the bus, and I put her on the back and chased the bus all the way up Gull Street. I caught it. Then suddenly realised I didn't have a licence to ride outside the Olympic Village. And we'd been given the Victorian police a pretty heavy time. So I had to sneak back into the Olympic Village on the bike after I got rid of a passenger. But
Was that the Olympic? Is that the? It's now Housing Commission, the Olympic Village in Heidelberg.
Yes.
Right.
It's one end was a Liberty Parade.
Just off Bell Street.
Well, no, it's
So more Murray Road.
Southern Road.
End of Murray Road.
Southern Road.
Just across the creek from
yes,
Northland.
that's right. Where across the river, the Olympic soccer stadium there, just across the.
Did they play Olympic soccer at that stadium?
Well, it's a practice ground for the athletes. They used to practice there, and the athletes used to train there. That was the training ground for the Olympic Village.
Just opposite the river from Northland Shopping Centre.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, they used to. Most of the athletic guys used to run around there, and the discus throws and the hammer throws used to practice there.
How was Bill Russell as a bloke on the bus?
He, well, I didn't. He was pretty much a star. I can remember, you know, I can remember him walking through the village or towards the gate of the village while I was manning it one day, completely surrounded by beautiful little black ladies, and who were obviously devoted to him. And he was. I don't think he spoke to people like that. I wasn't good looking enough, and I wasn't female. But on the bus, he was pretty good. The guy that I got to know really well, there were two guys. The assistant coach, a fellow called Bruce Drake, and
Assistant coach of the US team?
the assistant coach of the US team was Bruce Drake. He was from the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma. And after the Olympic Games, and I got on pretty well with Bruce, and after the Games he gave me the game notes from the American Olympic side, which contained their strategies for the Games, and in particular a thing called the Drake Shuffle, which I couldn't use here at Melbourne University, so I gave it to Ken Watson for the Australian side to use, and they used that in the 1960 Olympics.
Is this the Melbourne Tigers Lindsey Gaze shuffle offence?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Tigers can thank you.
Yeah, no question. I gave them the notes to start with. They didn't know what it was when I gave it to them. The fact was, I didn't know what it was either.
We've been running that offence for years.
I noticed it the other night.
Yeah, bit of first and thirds.
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
So Andrew Gaze basically has you to thank for his storied NBL career and all those easy baskets.
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, basically, I gave Ken Watson all of the notes from the American Olympic side.
Yep.
And because Ken was in a position to use it, and I wasn't in a position to use it here at Melbourne University. But if we can take the credit for the Australian Olympic side, good luck to us. You know, I have no problem with that. And I finished up with a towel from the American Olympic side and a pair of boots that I wore out over a period of the next 3 or 4 years from one of the players. And I used to take that towel every game and, you know, make sure everybody saw it. American Olympic side, you know. But no, that was probably the standout year. That was the first of 2 standout years, because it was at the end of that year that we approached the Mormon Church, got ourselves a coach, and then really started to learn about basketball. And I think that was the beginning. I think the game that we lost, the grand final, I think the guy who coached the side that beat us was Alan Landell, who had subsequently became coach of Melbourne University Basketball Club. I think that my memory might be playing tricks on me there, but I remember for many years having an aversion to Alan Landell. I'm pretty confident he was the opposing coach that we came up against on that evening. But he probably did what I saw here Saturday night.
When you came to our Big V game.
Yes, and when we went down and listened to the coach actually picked players of the opposing side and gave your team a rundown.
Yeah.
And I suspect that's what happened against us in that grand final, because I think that we were analysed and we were beaten by a better coach. Up until then, we played a fairly free-flowing sort of a game, and we were just outmanoeuvred that night.
How you came to the state league game here on the weekend?
Yes.
How did you compare the standard of play and the style of play, the athleticism, back to what you guys used to do compared to today's game?
Well, there are a couple of notable differences. So first of all, I thought I was in two minds with a lot of aspects of the game as to how our side of 57 would have compared to your side. I thought, for example, that your passing, we only learnt to pass the ball as hard as you guys passed the ball in 57. Prior to that, we didn't pass the ball that hard. But that's the first time we came up against that. So I thought your passing was probably better, but I didn't think your passing was as fast, as quick in terms of number of passes.
Ball movement.
Ball movement. I think our ball movement was certainly as good. I thought that your driving to the basket was much better than anything that we would have done. But the game was a different game. I mean, in our day, if you'd driven to the basket in the way that you guys did, you would have been fouled every time for charging.
Right.
An offensive charging foul. And I thought that when I watched the game on Saturday night, that in fact the umpires were wrong in a number of cases, because there were clear situations where the defensive player was in position, was not moving, and he was running to, and the foul was given against him. And that would have been quite wrong. I thought the game was far more physical in terms of contact, player to player, than what we were used to. I thought that the travelling, I saw a lot more travelling than what we would have tolerated or been allowed to have. I was surprised that you didn't take more shots from 15 odd feet out.
So mid-range.
Mid-range shot. But I was also surprised that a lot of the shots were taken where the rebounders were not in position. We wouldn't take a shot unless we had a rebounder available to have a go at the ball. And I thought that one of the interesting things is I thought our rebounding in those days was more aggressive, if that's possible. The defence, we used to play a combination of a zone defence and a man-to-man defence. Our zone defence was normally 3-2, maybe 2-1-2, but never 2-3, which is what I saw you guys were playing. We used to normally have our centre a bit higher up the key, and we used to roll off the centre.
In defence?
In offence, we used to roll off the centre. And I thought your ball handling was infinitely better than ours. I didn't think our ball handling was anywhere near as good as what I saw out there on Saturday night. I thought that, but that was, you would expect that over 60 years. You would expect that with coaching and a lot more training at a much lower level than the university level, where kids were taught how to do things properly. And this was the reasons the Americans were always so much better than the Australians when I played, is simply because they learned to play the game when they were much younger, and they learned to play it properly when they were much younger. Similar, I suppose, to our own Australian league, rules football, that they learned to play the game from experienced coaches at a much younger age than what they do in other sports. Generally speaking, I would have expected the current Melbourne University team to be, it would depend on the umpires. If you had our umpires, we would easily win.
Because we'd all fell out.
Because we all fell out by half time. If we had your umpires, we wouldn't have a hope in hell of winning, because we wouldn't adjust to the vigor of the game. I heard the coach tonight at training talking about, and yourself talking about injuries. Well, we didn't have those sort of injuries. Certainly people got injured from time to time, but injuries were few and far between, because it was literally a non-contact sport. You only get injuries with impact. Well, most of the time you get injuries with impact. But then, other than that, I thought it was a good game, interesting game.
It was an absolute honour to have all you guys along.
Well, thank you.
Very special environment. It's been an absolute honour having you along tonight as well, Norm.
That's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Let's hope we can get a few more there for a future alumni game.
Yeah, well, the next alumni event, we're going to hope that we get everyone along, and hopefully we'll have some more stories to tell.
Great.
Norm, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Pleasure.